everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on strategic threat hunting with SOAR and Threat Intel. I'm really excited for today's presentation, but before we begin, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent out to you via email upon the conclusion of today's session, so you can be on the lookout for that and rewatch at your convenience. And furthermore, we will be conducting a Q&A at the end of this presentation, so feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your control panel to ask those questions at any point in time throughout the webinar, and we'll help address all of those at the end. Joining me today is Chris Crawley, who has over 2 decades of cybersecurity experience, starting as a network engineer, moving on to a security analyst and an incident response manager, before becoming most recently a senior SANS instructor, where he's been at SANS for over the past 15 years, teaching a variety of SOC and security operations courses. So he has a ton of knowledge, industry expert to say the least. So really excited for what he's going to be going over today, including a couple of different optimal approaches to discovering and eradicating threats in your environment, how you can leverage threat intel data to make quick and informed decisions. Similarly, how you can use orchestration and automation for quicker and more strategic response, and furthermore, criteria, procedures, and playbooks necessary to increase your SOC's maturity. So a lot to cover today, a lot of great content. Super excited. I'm going to hand things over to Chris to just get us started.
That's great. I really do appreciate it. I want to thank you, Simplify, and Christopher for making this happen. As you said, there's a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump into it. The idea of it being strategic threat hunting is, rather than me showing you here in granular detail, here's one threat hunt, what I'm trying to do is describe the overall program that you can implement in order to make threat hunting a reality in your environment. And to do so, I'm going to start with a couple of foundational thoughts. And this is mostly around security operations. And then I'm going to have some foundational thoughts in terms of threat intelligence and how you can effectively use this. As I move from threat intelligence, I'll start talking about the workflows and how I tend to advocate that people develop workflows. And I'll give you a few examples of things which I've developed sort of as a generic picture of workflows in order to advise security operations, which then leads us to the idea of, if you have a comprehension of how you work, then you can look for orchestrating and automating it. I'll define those terms and I'll be able to provide some good guidance on how to do that. And then I'll talk about, how do you get there? How do you make your organization be an orchestrated and automated, effective security operations capability such that you can absorb threat intelligence and deploy it for threat hunting and development of use cases? So that's the plan for today. Let's get started. I'm going to start off with a foundational principle that I think is critically important, which is, what does your SOC actually have to do? And so I talk about this in the SOC class that I wrote as functional areas. I find this is a very effective way to have the conversation, because these functional areas can apply whether you have one person who's trying to cover all the aspects of doing security operations, or you have 100 or more people on staff in order to do these various SOC tasks. So I speak about these in order to be able to say, here's the stuff that your team needs to perform. If you have a dedicated team that's named this label, great. If you just have 5 people and they're trying to do all these things, that's what they're going to have to do as well. So we'll start off with the steering committee. The steering committee is comprised of people who are your constituents. And I use the term constituents to reflect the people who we're supposed to protect and their information systems. We want them to represent what's going well for them, what's changing in their environment, and also have an opportunity for us to express things to them. And this is a strategic team. But it's not the SOC itself, it's the way that the SOC interacts with the people that the SOC is supposed to defend. The command center is sort of a protective layer around all the work product that the SOC is trying to do and the people in the SOC. Command center answers the phones, it answers questions, it sends reporting out. It basically keeps the SOC on track. Monitoring is what most people think about for the SOC, which is looking at the data and identifying that there are problems. Threat intelligence, I consider this both the ingestion or consumption of exterior information related to threats which might be affecting us, as well as the production of information about activity which we've observed in our environment, which we can retain for the extended period of time in order to help us to have advantage over our adversaries. But we might also share this with other people in order to help them to gain some of that same advantage over attackers who are working to harm them as well. Incident handling is when things go wrong. And of course, any of these could be outsourced. Any of these could be separate capabilities. I'm putting this all within the security operations because these are necessary for effective performance of a SOC. Forensic analysis is the deep dive authoritative investigation of information assets in order to identify what happened. And self-assessment is a grouping of vulnerability scanning, pen testing, baseline development, the management of the information assets in a secure fashion. We want to have a picture of what we're doing as an organization, and self-assessment is intended to give us that picture of our security posture. Another foundational concept which we need to make sure that we have set up is the idea of use cases versus hunting. Use cases, to me, are engineered detections. And I'm going to talk about how I advise people to engineer these detections. Hunting is creative, it is ad hoc, and further, it acknowledges that our engineered detections have failed. And I say, bring a healthy dose of skepticism. This is the time when we can discount that the tools are actually working like they're supposed to. I want some of that in my environment because not only does it help me to identify problems, it also is an opportunity for my staff to develop new capability. So for use cases, I have a sequence that I advocate that people go through. Start off with the business relevance. Why does the organization care about us spending a whole bunch of time and effort to engineer a detection? If you cannot actually identify the business relevance, which justifies you developing all of this detection capability, stop. Don't do it. It's probably better as a hunt. If you have strong business relevance, then you should probably invest in the engineering. What I say is to identify a storyline of what might happen and then decompose that story into specific elements so that you can identify artifacts in the data, which you can then go and extract from the information systems. Use those data elements in order to identify detection opportunities. That is, how do I know if this is authorized or unauthorized? Within the data that I have at my disposal, I describe these as detection opportunities. I may also seek within the information systems that I have enrichment by correlating to other information components. I might also, at this point, look for threat intelligence information based on assets that we're interacting with. And these assets might be anything from a file or a file hash or a mutex inside of a process out to an IP address that's on the internet or a reputation of a domain. This is where we leverage threat intelligence information within our use case construction. Then we implement it. We don't always have to implement use cases in SIMs. We can implement it in other tools. A SOAR tool could actually implement a use case for detection. We don't have to implement it in the SIM or the SOAR, but it's actually important to realize that you should be deciding on the right technology to implement it. Assessment is the ongoing measurement of how effective these use cases are, and then we change them or get rid of them depending upon their effectiveness. Hunting is a totally different program of operation. I'm going to talk about hunting from the outcomes for it because I don't want to tell you exactly how to do it. I'll give you some structure in terms of how you should tell your staff to do it. But the outcomes are, number one, actual detects. I really want to discover if there's a thing that's in my environment that's a problem. That's my primary reason for hunting. But Another thing where I derive substantial value from hunting is the operational capture of the things that were done. And these might be rules where I build them back into a system, some sort of endpoint detection system. I might also develop a script to make it so that the steps that I did this time are easier for me to do next time. This could actually be bundled into a SOAR task where I can actually build a sequence, but I start with a small granular sort of nugget where I can then perform that task repeatedly. If I can show that part of my outcome of hunting is an operational capture that's reusable by other staff later, that's substantial value that can be shown to be worth spending the time doing hunting. Another thing that I want out of hunts are ideas for use cases. I don't want the hunt effort to be burdened with building use cases. But if we're doing something from a hunting perspective and we can say this has substantial business relevance and I can see how we could engineer this in the future, now that I've done it in an ad hoc manual fashion, well, we just put it in the queue. Time to build that use case. And another part of this is the idea of posture improvement. Now, when I say posture improvement, what I mean is when we notice a deficiency or a problem or an enhancement, but the change that's necessary is outside of our jurisdiction for controlling those information systems, I advocate producing a report, which I call posture improvement. It's not always easy for other people to accept being told that they're doing things wrong or poorly or inefficiently or in some form of a deficient fashion. So I like to document this in a posture improvement report. And I say, this is part of what we do on a regular basis. We identify deficiencies. If you don't have the time or the resources or the inclination to fix that posture, we understand we're short on staff too. We're short on resources as well. But we've identified it as a potential problem, and it's really in your domain to fix that problem. And we might be able to help you to fix that problem, but it's not up to us to fix it. Call this posture enhancement. Okay. And so in hunting, from an overview perspective, what we do for hunting is I want a hunt plan. And I'm going to talk about what the syntax of that actually looks like in just a moment here. The idea is that you start with a plan. If you deviate from the plan, that's okay. But I don't want people just starting without some initial depiction of what they're going to do. Okay. You can take my spreadsheet because this is a nice way for me to communicate the structure in that spreadsheet. I can actually directly use the structure. What I want to do is I want to minimize the administrative overhead of actually setting up a hunt and doing it by actually adding a little bit of administrative overhead to make it so that the person who's doing the hunt has broad latitude to do what they want to do during it. And so I have this sort of plan syntax where I talk about serial numbers. Why? Serial numbers for a hunt? Well, I want to capture what we do. And if you want to do the same hunt again, great. You've already documented it. I've reduced the administrative overhead and burden for you doing that. I talk about the name, what it is, why I'm doing this, what data I think that I'll need, how I'm going to collect it, what sort of analytical techniques I intend to use in terms of doing this hunt, and then references or where I got this idea. And this might be a threat intelligence bulletin that we saw online. This might be something where I talk about it and it's like, hey, Chris assigned this hunt to me and I really hate it. So I actually have this, spreadsheet, and I'll provide a link at the end for resources for a bunch of these documents that I'm talking about inside of here that you can download them. And this is one of them. So I want broad latitude in order to change during the hunt, but I also want some thoughtful intention going into the hunt. And so I have my hunt plan. And then I also have a hunt recap, which also is a report. And I have a spreadsheet for that. And it's, here's what we did, right? Here's what the outcomes were. I found something. We've detected something. That should just be a count. I have a script now, and here's the path. Whatever sort of knowledge management or file sharing that you have, I'd like to have it in the report. Here's the path to that file, that script that I created, so that when other people are reading the report, they can quickly access that information. Right? I might have some posture improvement reports and I can reference that. I might have actually created a rule as part of the effort of this hunt. Great. I might even have that rule as basically, here it is, I've already written it. I might have a list of, these are all the rules that I would like to write. based on this hunt so that we can detect these things in a more automated fashion. And then finally, a yes or no answer. Is this a good candidate for use case? So if you're recapping your hunt and you're like, yeah, we should really do this, and you just put that into the location where we're tracking all the hunt activity at the end of the week or the end of the month, I or the people who are responsible for building use cases can collect that information and say, oh, look, 17 people reported that this particular hunt, that serial number that's included in the hunt recap, this particular hunt would be a good use case. We should probably put that into a use case, right? So this is making the important information easy for people to track. And then the people who are transforming hunts into use cases have that information available to them. And if we deploy a small amount of rigor at the start and at the end of our hunt, it actually lets us spend more time being creative. So I want to develop metrics out of this, right? I want to be able to report, here's how many we detected in our hunting. Here are how many posture improvement reports. Here's how many use cases we actually developed based on ideas that were developed in our hunts. This is a valuable thing for us to be able to track over time. I also think it's okay to do the same hunt over and over again. Why? Because there are some scenarios which don't lend themselves to automated detections well. And hunting is our skepticism of those tools. Hunting is our acknowledgement that the sim might not have a capture. And so we're going to continue to hunt. And so this is your engine of adaptability. Something brand new comes out, and you get notified by a governmental CERT team that a vendor appears to be compromised by an effective and well-financed threat actor, and included that information. And included a remote access tool in the standard distribution of that vendor's software. And I mean, everybody, when I'm saying that scenario, is thinking about SolarWinds, but that isn't the first time that happened, and it won't be the last time. What do you do in response to that sort of updated threat intelligence? You adapt your detections quickly, right? That's what we want. We want to have an adaptive engine, and our hunting is that specific thing. When you learn about new stuff, go out and look for it. Okay. And that sort of example of use of threat intelligence in a hunting program is retroactive. It doesn't always have to be retroactive. It can be proactive, where you think about that scenario and you say, how would I look for that next time without having the specific indicators of compromise associated with the SolarWinds breach? How would I look for that thing? Right? How would I hunt for that? So that before the bulletins come out, I'm finding that. Okay. And so I want to make sure that my hunting stays flexible, and I'm structuring it in a way that my SOC is able to engineer things effectively. And I call those use cases. However, I'm not building a help desk, right? I'm building a security operations capability which is adaptable and flexible. So I need to sanction certain amounts of time for my staff in order to drive enhancement and capability and flexibility and creativity. I want my SOC to be perceived by the organization as the team that deals with adversity, as the team that's trustworthy when there's a serious problem. And I want to have the organization's confidence in my capability to react to novel situations. Okay. In order to do that, I need to design my SOC with intentional flexibility, and I need to acknowledge that I must expend resources for double checking when we have things in place. I need to be able to do that efficiently, but I need to be able to do that. So let's talk a little bit about threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is intended to provide us with strategic and tactical advantage over our adversaries. The threats for our environments, all of us, right? We are in a situation where those threats operate as profit centers for their organizations. We, our defensive capabilities, operate as cost centers for our organizations. Speak to anybody in business and say, if there was a competition between a profit center and a cost center, who do you think would win over time? Okay. We offer a promise of loss prevention, and we frequently have issues actually delivering that consistently. Okay. So this is pretty hard. It's a hard reality to face. There are adversaries out in the world who are better financed than we are, and we're fighting against them. Okay. A lot of SOCs talk about using threat intelligence. And when I actually push the issue and start the conversation with people about how they effectively use threat intelligence, it usually boils down to the feed enriches our SIM. And I say, how exactly does that help the analysts? And the person often punts in answering that question. I just made an example of use cases of how to actually enrich with threat intelligence. Do so selectively, figure out what it means. If you have no other picture of how you use threat intelligence, I want you to leverage this picture. This is an adaptation of the executive summary, figure 1, from the United States Department of Defense Science Board's paper, Resilient Military Systems and the Advanced Cyber Threat, wherein the Defense Science Board briefed the Office of the Secretary of Defense in a publicly available report, which you can download, to say that the cyber threat that exists can basically be grouped into 3 types of attackers. The $10 club, who is able to reuse exploits which other people have published. The $1 million club, which is able to discover new exploits and leverage them. And the $1 billion club, which is able and financed to be able to introduce vulnerabilities into the targets which the $1 billion club wants to attack. If you think that you are fighting against the $1 billion club, right, and you probably are in the sights of the $1 billion club, even as a stepping stone to some other organization. But if you think that you're actively engaging the $1 billion club, you should be able to express your confidence in addressing that type of threat. Okay. And this is at the bare minimum how you should converse about threat intelligence with key decision makers in your organization. And I'm going to talk about some other specific, detailed ways to use threat intelligence here in a moment. I'm going to start with executive summary figure number 1. If you're not using this to convey the simplest depiction of threat intelligence to your key decision makers, please start using this. It's understandable. That's why it is the first figure in the executive summary of this DSB report. Additionally, when we start to go down in the weeds, which I don't advise you to do with key decision makers, you can use things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Very popular because it's an amazing resource. The MITRE ATT&CK framework talks about a number of different uses for its matrices, one of which is a defensive gap analysis, wherein you look at the identified techniques that adversaries can use, or behaviors, right, that adversaries can use. And you look to yourself and self-assess your confidence and your ability to identify, maybe even stop, these specific behaviors of the adversary. If you look at this defensive gap analysis, it looks like for what it would look like for most people. There is not a lot of high confidence coverage. That's okay. This can help you in order to drive maturity. If you look at the threat actors who are specifically using behaviors which target your market sector, you can then crosswalk your defensive gap analysis, see where you are worst compared to where your adversaries tend to act, and then enhance those detection and responsive capabilities. This is the application of threat intelligence in order to drive maturity within your SOC. And it starts with that defensive gap analysis, and then it goes into what the MITRE ATT&CK original paper describing it, their original white paper, talked about using the MITRE ATT&CK framework to do maturity assessments. And Andy Applebaum of the MITRE organization actually gave a great talk in terms of exactly how MITRE does this. And it entailed doing a defensive gap analysis, crosswalking the weaknesses to adversary behaviors which are likely to be encountered, and then providing a roadmap of improvements specific to that SOC deployment. And so from a picture of how we apply threat intelligence, we want to think about the strategic aspect of this. From a strategy, can I reasonably expect my security operations center to engage the $10 club? I think that for absolutely everybody in the world, if you have funding which allows you to have a security operations center of some form, you should be engaging at the $10 club level. Can you engage at the $1 million club level? Probably, but you need to make most efficient uses of your resource in order to deal with adversaries who have the capability and the funding to come up with novel exploitation capability. And then are you dealing with the $1 billion club? The $1 billion club is the well-funded adversary who usually is a nation state level actor who is able to interdict supply chain in order to introduce vulnerabilities specifically to target you. Have that conversation with your strategic decision makers on what level of funding and capability is expected from the SOC. It's a nice way to have that conversation. It might not be a nice conversation, but it's a really clear-cut way to have that specific conversation. We can use threat intelligence in order to drive enhancement in our use cases. Once we've decided there's a thing that we really need to detect, we can then go seek threat intelligence which is relevant to the specific use case. And in our enhancement action, we can look for additional decision-making and differentiation opportunities for the analyst. When you build a use case and enrich it with threat intelligence, the question that you should be asking yourself is, how is this going to help the analyst who is looking at this particular alert? How is it going to help that analyst understand whether this is a false positive or something which warrants continued investigation? That's how we build it into use cases. From hunting, this should be an inspiration to our hunting action. The threat intelligence which is available should be an inspiration to our hunters. This is a problem that's out there in the world right now. Let's go look and see if we have it before the rule-based detections come out. Additionally, hunters should look at these not as here's a new set of IOCs, let me go hunt for that, because I don't even really consider that hunting. I consider that retroactive identification using updated indicators of compromise. Hunting is, let me think about the technique that the adversary is using and then figure out how I would find that no matter what indicator of compromise I'm actually deploying. And from a business perspective, I'd ask you the question, do you consistently offer threat intelligence as a product to your business? Are you talking about mergers and acquisitions with the mergers and acquisition folks prior to them announcing that they're going to merge or buy a company, merge with or buy a company? Are you providing competitive analysis in the marketplace using threat intelligence? Because those competitors might actually be targeting you and collecting information on your organization as a competitive advantage using open source intelligence in order to do so. So as I think about work in the SOC, I think about developing an overall program of operations. And I use the generic term workflow to describe all of this activity. The security orchestration and automation tool, one very effective way to deploy this tool is to glue together technologies. And I'll talk about this specifically in terms of orchestration in a moment, but it is to glue together technologies which don't directly already communicate with one another. In order to talk about this, I would like to understand how we work before I start trying to glue stuff together. Ultimately, I would like to be able to map all of my procedures, my technology, my staff, the inputs from one process to another, and the expected outputs. If I can begin to map that capability, then I can begin to actually gain full leverage in an orchestration and automation tool. It also drives maturity within my SOC. So as I mentioned, I have these various functions. And with these functions, I then have my steering committee, which is going to operate in looking at the reports and other information that comes into it, deciding on risk, deciding on performance, directing change. The change being directed is going to flow into my various portions of my security operations center. Again, this might be one person who's receiving this direction. It might be 100 people with 3 layers of management who are receiving direction from the steering committee saying you need to change these things. I would expect the various functions to be able to actually identify what they do, how they do it, and change themselves in order to meet the capabilities that are necessary for them to continue to operate within the SOC. I ingest threat intelligence, I track adversaries, I mine data in my workflow of my threat intelligence, and how I do this and how I interact with the other teams is something which is tracked on an ongoing basis. Right? This is the workflow which I use to describe a generic security operations center, interacting across these various functions, performing discrete processes which are mapped to work together in a way that makes the entire system effective and efficient. Again, as I mentioned, I will have a resource at the end where you could download not this depiction of it, but a Visio diagram, which actually shows these various aspects. My forensics have various specializations in order to be able to acquire evidence and process it and then report back out on that. And throughout all of this, my teams, which are doing the self-assessment, are driving information back into my detective and responsive capabilities of my SOC in order to be able to convey a perspective on what the current state is of my environment. Similar to that sort of process-driven workflow, I have the idea of interaction between staff as my workflow. This is a picture of a 6-shift SOC, which is geographically disparate in order to provide follow the sun 24/7 coverage, operating in core business hours in different regions with 2 shifts per location. This was something that I was working with an organization, and then I eventually folded it back into my SOC class where I said, if I had to work with only 6 shifts, this is how I would do handoffs, is I would actually stagger the early and late shifts so that I had staff working where there was a very long overlap. Because most of the time when we do handoffs, it's 15 minutes of, okay, here's the stuff, gotta go, good luck. I don't like that. I don't think that that's efficient. I don't think that it's effective. I would rather have an extended period of time where I'm able to have 2 people working together in order to facilitate the handoff. And what this does is it actually creates multiple pairs of people in order to facilitate handoffs. This is another aspect of workflow that I think is really important to consider how your SOC is going to run. Another aspect of this is the idea of how we do analysis. This is a question that I ask most people who run security operations centers. Do you have an analytical methodology whereby everybody on the team is actually going to perform work in the same way? And I usually get some blank stares and some blinking eyes, questioning glances saying, what do you mean an analytical methodology? Let me give you one if you don't have one. This is the analysis of competing hypotheses. It was written by Richards J. Hauer. Hauer was an intelligence analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, and he published a book by the CIA, publication body. The book is called The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. And in that book, one of the chapters deals with a methodology for performance of intelligence analysis, which he calls analysis of competing hypotheses. You start with brainstorming. You then list out the data that you have available. You refine it into a matrix for decision making. You identify the data elements which you depend on after you have, in a quantitative way, expressed the conclusions that you have. Good. I don't directly use ACH. I do use it in a sort of a simplified version for methodology of analysis. I think that it's a phenomenal thinking framework. One of the things that I find in security operations centers that we're really terrible about is reporting well. And so part of the modified ACH, which I like to use, is a requirement that there is peer review of reporting prior to it being shared outside of the SOC. And if what I just described resonates with you and you think, I would really like to have those things, well, a lot of people would really like to have those things because it gives us enhanced efficiency. We can actually measure our precision over time. We gain repeatability. And most importantly, we can actually deal with complex scenarios and perform analysis under pressure with high confidence in our analytical output. It would be nice if we could do that quickly too, because there's usually time pressure on us. But I would rather have high confidence and be slow than have low confidence and be fast. Your organization might disagree with that. I'm willing to share my rationale and thoughts behind that. And the simple version of that rationale and thinking about I'd rather high confidence slowly is I can build speed into the program once the program is effective. If I have a fast program which is ineffective, building effectiveness into the program, I think, is much more difficult than building speed into the program. Okay, so this is how I want to approach this. I frequently will consider the orchestration and automation tools in order to help me to accomplish all of these things. So let's talk about what orchestration and automation actually are. The idea of orchestration and the definition, which I took from Wikipedia because it's a nice place as a basis for definitions, is orchestration is the automated configuration, coordination, and management of computer systems and software. And so in security operations, we tend to focus on the coordination between various systems. Right. And the software and applications and data sets that are running on those systems. So the use that we most commonly employ for orchestration is actually to make it so that we have different systems working in a coordinated fashion. Automation is, by definition, a process or procedure that is performed with minimum human assistance. And so we usually talk about automating specific steps of a procedure for circumstances that are defined that we'd like to do. Now, I am going to, for the next couple of slides, maintain a distinction between orchestration and automation. In practice, I rarely maintain that distinction. Right? I talk about orchestration and automation because it doesn't really matter when we're doing it if we're orchestrating or automating. What we're doing is we're making things more efficient, more effective, more precise, and able to have high confidence in the completion of a certain set of steps. That being said, I also want to talk about where it should be used and where it should not be used before I set out to start deploying orchestration automation. So the uses of orchestration, which are phenomenal in security operations, are the extraction of related or correlated data across multiple systems, especially if we have not pre-aggregated that information. If there's more data that I want, I can have my orchestration tool go get that for me. And I could actually predefine what those things are, which would then allow me to say, the analyst needs to make a decision. The information which we typically use based on past experience for making that decision is this list of data. That data is not readily available in our SIM. Orchestration tool, go fetch. And so this becomes a way that I can fetch correlation data, threat intelligence, repository information in our own internal reports where we've encountered specific adversaries, and we can pull those things out for anything which looks related. Right? I could also use my orchestration in order to guide the analyst through a sequence of considerations in a complex scenario. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about doing this other thing? Here are all the containment opportunities which are at your disposal. Which would you like to do? Right? That idea of orchestration becomes really powerful. However, I want to identify a boundary for the orchestration. I don't want the orchestration tool specifically responsible for synthesizing the information collected and coming up with a conclusion. That's why I have analysts. The task to support that synthesis can be orchestrated. The synthesis and analysis, not directly orchestrated. Good. Additionally, I don't want us to try to orchestrate when we have circumstances where we don't know what's going on. Before we've decided that, yes, this is a really good match to that specific pattern, we shouldn't try to deploy orchestration for that. I should spend more time in a manual basis learning in order to decide which scenario this is most like. And another part of this is I may be doing something with my orchestration tool which is illegal. Now, some people are like, how could you, what do you mean? Well, what about moving data out of one jurisdiction into another jurisdiction where it is not legally permissible to do so? Right. So we also have to consider the practical, legal, privacy type restrictions where, yeah, technically we could do that, but we're not allowed to. Automation is an opportunity for us to say, here's a series of steps. Let's get it done without a lot of human interaction. There are lots of opportunities for this. I started working as a Unix systems administrator when I was 15 years old. Right? I worked on Ultrix and VMS systems. And I worked with a whole bunch of geeks. This was in Massachusetts, near where I grew up. I worked with a whole bunch of geeks who, basically found this one company in Cambridge, Massachusetts to be too corporate. And by the way, this was like in the late 80s. So BBN, was getting too corporate for them. So they joined this startup, which was basically integrated circuit chip design firm, which produced open source software for universities in Massachusetts to drive hardware engineers' educational sort of programs. So these were the systems administrators that I learned from, right? A bunch of hardcore geeks in the late 80s who decided it would be feasible to hire a 15-year-old kid to run tape backup, right? And something which in my impressionable young mind, was basically put in place and remains to this day is this system administrator's mantra. If I have to do this a couple times or more, should I automate it? The answer is usually yes. However, I want you to consider the paradox of automation. The paradox of automation states that the more complex that we make systems, the less likely that human beings are going to be able to intervene in the operation of that system in order to deal with an unexpected fault, unexpected problem or issue. Okay. So lots of scary examples abound, but I really want you to think about this. If you automate the system so much, you effectively lose intervention control. They've made movies about this. We've had real life terrible scenarios where people have gotten hurt or killed because the automation ran amok. And so for my automation boundaries, I think about this is when I don't want to automate stuff. If I do not have clearly defined parameters of accuracy, success, or things to avoid, I probably shouldn't automate that whole thing. If my IT operational procedures are not well defined, I shouldn't automate it. If my continuity of operations and the techniques available to me to recover when there's a problem, which my automation might have introduced, I don't want to automate. If I can't show that I could successfully recover from an issue, I probably shouldn't start automating there. And if the technology that I'm dealing with is a newly acquired technology or I don't understand how it works, I shouldn't start by automating it. And these are things which hearing it from me in this context probably makes sense. Actually preserving those boundaries when people are pressuring you to automate stuff is a harder task to do. So I'm going to talk about the strategy of deploying SOAR and some tactical examples of this. First thing is I want to have an understanding of my workflow. That's why I spent a bunch of time talking about what workflow looks like. I want you to have an understanding, maybe not as granular a picture as I have available for some of those, but an understanding of your workflow. Additionally, your own DevSecOps flow. I want you to be able to say, here's where we develop stuff, here's where we test it, and then here's how we promote it to production. If you don't have that, I don't think that you should be actually saying that you're going to deploy SOAR. Why? Because you're not deploying it in a mature fashion. The SOAR deployment project might actually be incentive to build that capability. Okay. And so that deployment or implementation aspect, you might end up with a couple internal people deploying this. You might also, in a very externally motivated organization, I think that this would be an appropriate approach to this. Get a third party to assist you with the deployment. Why? Because an externally motivated organization, and I'm using that term in the context of Geert Hofstede's organizational cultural dimensions. So if you want to know more about what I'm talking about there, but the short version of it is some organizations only listen to advice when an exterior party tells them that that's what they should do. If you are a very externally motivated organization overall, you should probably have an implementation team for your SOAR that is outside because your internal parties will be more likely to listen to that direction. In terms of your DevSecOps, what I mean by that is I want you to have a strategic imperative to be mature in the way that you deploy things. That is, I would rather you have a slow developing capability that will allow you to go fast later. If you don't have a plan for development, quality assurance, and deployment, whatever you want to call that, if you want to use an agile framework, it doesn't matter to me. However you do this, I want it to be defined and I want it to be followed. Okay? Fix that problem. And this is a combination of a strategic imperative with a tactical implementation. And so our tactical deployment of SOAR is us deciding on specific procedures, which we understand what success looks like and what failure looks like. We understand what things to avoid. We talk to the staff who commonly do these things. We look for circumstances where precision is necessary. And I want you to think about deploying one SOAR task into your testing environment. scrutinize it aggressively, and then publish it to production. In order to do this, I approach this from the ACH perspective. Do a brainstorm of everything that you do, even if they're not documented procedures, a brainstorm of absolutely everything that you do. And then go through and identify the specificity of, do you expect people to follow the steps exactly, or am I just going to give them general objectives and expect them to do the details on their own? If I'm expecting them to just take some general objectives and do the details on their own, it's probably not a good candidate at first for our orchestration and automation. Sub-steps therein might be good. So once we identify good candidates for our deployment of orchestration and automation, and we are able to articulate what level of specification that we want for each of those procedures, we work out the very detailed flow of the sequence of exactly what we want to automate, and then we set about deploying that. And so this then becomes the ultimate aggregation of all of these disparate steps, where we can identify which parts of our flow are automated, which parts require human action. And we're able to then show at a programmatic view how we work. If you can describe your workflow in this fashion, you are probably well on your way to be able to deploy an orchestration automation tool. I mentioned that I would share a resource page. It's this one on this particular slide, soc-class.com/res, short for resources. So I just want to recap here with my key takeaways. You need both use cases in hunting. This is engineering and adaptability. You need threat intelligence in order to provide guidance on what we're fighting against. You may do this retroactively, shift into doing it predictively. Our defined workflows help us to understand our own capability, and then drives us to become more automated and orchestrated in our deployment efforts. If you want to effectively deploy a SOAR tool, consider what you do, consider opportunities for that deployment, and look for places where you can augment the analyst capability and do things at a higher level of efficiency and precision, but than the analyst. But please don't expect that SOAR tool to get rid of the analyst. So that was a quick tour on my thoughts on strategic threat hunting with SOAR and using threat intelligence. Christopher, were there any questions that came in during the talk?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris, for that presentation. I know that was a lot of information. As mentioned, we'll jump into the Q&A now. So you can use the control panel at the bottom of your screen to ask those questions at any point in time. But just getting started with a few of the questions that came in. Our playbooks are defined for our procedures for staff. Why do I need to still put specifics in, as you mentioned?
Okay, so if you have playbooks which are already defined, right? I'm talking about not putting specifics into the procedure. I'm talking about the idea of expressing to the staff members what level of specificity I expect them to actually work with. I mentioned my 3 different levels of specificity: exact steps to follow, steps plus some specific details, or just sort of a general set of instructions. I have the experience of writing procedures or playbooks or workflows for lots of different types of organizations. Some staff only want to follow exact steps. If I'm telling them they have to think and do sort of, general sort of objectives and fill in the details and gaps, I expect them to be able to do that. But if I'm designing a workflow where at some point I expect exact precision and following it exactly the way I want them to do it. And in other cases, the workflow is just sort of, I don't know, you figure it out and fill in the gaps. I owe them that guidance of which I really mean exactly specifically and which I mean somewhat objectively. And this is hard to do from someone who is designing workflow for other people. Oftentimes, for other people who have sort of a mixed bag of experience and capability and have an individual preference of effectively either saying, look, just tell me what to do, or look, stop telling me what to do because I know better than you how to accomplish this objective, and your very directive procedures are impeding me from being efficient and effective. Okay, so that's what I mean when I talk about specificity in your playbooks and in your procedures.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Another follow-up question. Do you think that threat intelligence is just a cyber bubble waiting to burst?
No. I think that threat intelligence is not a bubble. I think that threat intelligence is something that should drive our capability to deploy our scarce resources. And I really do mean this. Threat intelligence is tactical and strategic advantage over our adversaries. The only way that you can hope to overcome a better funded or adversary is to learn everything you can about how they are operating and deploy your scarce resources to intervene with their operations and drive their costs up to the point where they're no longer profitable for their organization.
Cool. Looks like we've had one more question come in so far, and this question is specific to SOAR. It sounds like this individual is looking to get approval for a SOAR tool in their specific organization, and they were curious how you recommend justifying it to their higher-ups.
Yep. I think that there's a value proposition that you can actually identify. If you take that spreadsheet that I mentioned, it's in that resources will link to a Google Drive. You can download the spreadsheet. If you don't have the SOAR tool currently, take that spreadsheet as an initial sort of start on your brainstorming. You transform that into all of the things that you do. You then identify the things where there's an opportunity for precision, there are clear outcomes and there are clear values, and then show your decision makers how, by offloading some of that routine and labor intensive activity, you can gain efficiency and put a dollar sign associated with that. Okay. So speculate how much time you will save an analyst on a daily basis and put a dollar sign with that. And then say, we're not going to get rid of the analysts. We're still going to be paying those analysts to be here to do the work. However, those analysts will be now free to do more complicated efforts, such as use case development or threat hunting, such as also being able to assure that our IT partners in this cybersecurity effort are able to actually trust us to do actions on their systems in an automated fashion, because they have been able to define the steps which are authorized for our temporary containment actions, as an example, and allow us to automate that action, not only saving our time, but saving our IT team's time and making it so that we have a lower likelihood of causing collateral damage in the circumstances where we need to do containment. I think that sort of automated configuration change alone is an easy sell in terms of a value proposition to your management and to their management, in order to show the organization that you want to have maturity and precision and effectiveness and speed and confidence in all of the things that you do from within the SOC. And you can show how the SOAR tool would actually deliver that.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. It looks like those are all of the questions that have come in at this point. So I believe we can wrap up the webinar at this point. I do want to quickly mention that if you are interested in additional threat hunting assets or further information on SOAR or threat intel, you can certainly find that on our website and our resource center. We have videos, guides. I'll even include some in the follow-up email to this presentation. So please don't hesitate to dive deeper or even reach out with any additional questions you may have.
Great. Thank you very much, Christopher. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.